Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Megan from Metcalf. I'm the Network and Programs Director here at Ontario Culture Days. We're so very excited to have you here for this conversation with Tanya Lukin Linklater and Karen Pheasant-Neganigwane. We're also doing this in partnership with the Toronto Biennial of Art. So Ontario Culture Days is a month-long celebration of arts and culture taking place across Ontario each year, starting at the end of September. This year, the festival is running from September 24th to October 24th. So I realize we're getting to the last weekend, but there are still lots of things to do, both in person and online. I'm going to put the website for the full listings from all of our partners in the chat in just a moment. In addition to supporting organizations that host their own programming, we also work to produce some of our own programs, just like this one we have here, in partnership with the Toronto Biennial of Art. This event has been financially assisted by the Ontario Cultural Attractions Fund of the Government of Ontario through the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism and Culture, and is also supported by the Ontario Arts Council. Thank you to our funders. So before I get any further, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. Ontario Culture Days is active throughout the province, beyond borders, and across multiple Indigenous territories. We acknowledge Indigenous peoples as the original caretakers of the lands and waterways on which we work, create, gather, and live. I acknowledge that Toronto, the land on which our offices are situated and where I am now, is home to many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also honor and recognize the recorded and unrecorded Indigenous nations that have, are, and will continue to inhabit this land. Ontario Culture Days is committed to a continuous process of education and dismantling colonial approaches while celebrating the varied cultural and artistic traditions of Indigenous communities. We're committed to fostering meaningful relationships with these communities and supporting a diversity of Indigenous practices, art forms, and cultural expressions. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work and create on this land. So now I'm going to get the bios of the speakers going, and then I'm going to pass it off. So Karen Pheasant-Neganigwane is an Anishinaabe advocator for social change through expressions of dance, text, and teaching. Karen's path to activism and scholarly work started as a youth during the height of the civil rights era of the 1970s. The social project of Rochelle College in Toronto, led with idealism, artistic spirit, and free speech, provided the embryonic opening for her inquisitive spirit. Through ceremony and mentorship, she spent the last 40 years mentored by iconic Indigenous scholars from the Great Lakes of her people to Treaty 3, Treaty 6, and currently in Treaty 7. Tanya Lukin Linklater's performances, works for camera, installations, and writings center histories of Indigenous peoples' lives, land, and structures of sustenance. Her performances in relation to objects, scores, and ancestral belongings generate what she has come to call structures. Felt structures. And then finally, our moderator today, Claire Butcher, is a curator and educator from Zimbabwe who cooks and collaborates as part of her practice. She is working as curator for public programming and learning with the Toronto Biennial of Art's amazing team, wondering what the future of gathering and learning together might be, as well as how to show artist-led education that can transform the curriculum. So on that note, I am going to pass it over to Claire to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Megan, so much for that wonderful introduction and acknowledgement. And so lovely to see everyone here. Hey, Tanya, I see you coming back on camera. And Karen, yeah, just welcome to you, especially as esteemed guests this evening. And yeah, thanks especially to Ontario Culture Days for hosting this and really, yeah, supporting this conversation, which I'm so excited to have. We've anticipated it for months, so I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. But in the meantime, also just want to welcome everyone here, as well as I see a few colleagues from the Biennial also popping up. Just wonderful that you could all make time to share with us this evening. Just as we sort of get started, I think we all realized we were like a little bit nervous this evening. So I also just wanted to invite everyone to maybe take a breath. I know it's been a long week, maybe for many of us. And just as you take a deep breath and kind of, yeah, situate yourself to kind of just think about what you're bringing with you this evening and where you are and the body that you're in and what you're bringing with you in terms of those knowledges and carried practices that we each yeah, share with one another in these spaces of gathering, even if virtual. And maybe, yeah, if you feel like it, pop a note in the chat to say hello or where you're coming from. It's always lovely just to get a sense of, yeah, who's in the room, even though we can't sort of physically be in the same space together this evening. Just in preparing for this part of what has been a very long conversation for Karen and Tanya, it's been a multi-year relationship and growing together. And I think for myself, and thank you especially to Tanya for inviting me into this conversation to moderate. We've been thinking a lot together over the last months about yeah, just how to share with all of you, I think, the contexts of learning and mentoring that, first brought Tanya and Karen together, as well as the relationships and processes that continue to shape, their really dynamic practices as artists, as scholars, as writers, as educators, also in this kind of space of thinking together as well. And I think some questions have emerged from that conversation that I just thought to kind of name up top, even if we don't necessarily get to those this evening, just to sort of surface them a little bit. We've been thinking about, what scales and histories and vocabularies and lived experiences form embodied learning methodologies and types of engagement. And for both Karen and Tanya, these are so foundational in their work. And I'm so excited to hear more of that this evening. And I know, yeah, we'll get there. And another important question, I think, is how are those kinds of knowledges and practices acknowledged and valued and resourced, within these different fields that both Tanya and Karen are working in, which cross community, artistic spaces, academic spaces, also these cultural contexts as well, and more discursive spaces. And in that, I think, particularly, and it was included in my bio as well, I've been thinking a lot about the curriculum and the way that that word is actually coming from an embodied root where it's about running a track, actually, and thinking about how we learn within the body. And often I think, a lot of us are kind of schooled into separating mind and body, or that learning is something that is cerebral and not to be done with multiple senses. And I think for both Karen and Tanya, your work encapsulates just the comprehensiveness and multisensory aspects of what learning and sharing can be. And I think that question of how we might complicate the curriculum or approaches to it based on these kinds of methodologies is a really important one to keep in mind this evening. So just to kind of talk to a bit of the structure for tonight, I also did want to bring a note in Karen's words that this is not a drive-by lesson. This is really something that we're sort of inviting you to tune into, but also to continue engaging with, that this is hopefully just one iteration of meeting together and of encountering these practices and questions, but we encourage you to kind of continue thinking through those and how they relate to you as well in the work that you're doing. We'll start by kind of grounding the conversation through texts that Karen and Tanya are going to share that they've written and we'll reflect on a little bit as a starting point to also just respond to one another and think together further. And then we'll have some time for a question and answer period at the end. So we invite you to pop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little speech bubble with a Q&A. Feel free to pop your questions in there as soon as you have them, and Megan and I will do our best to also field those to Karen and Tanya at the end of our time together. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Karen very gratefully, and thank you so much for being here with us, Karen. And yeah, I'm so honored and excited to hear what you're going to share with us this evening.
Bonjour, Danse, Ani, greetings, wonderful people. My heart's fluttering. I'm just quickly reading, and I want to say hello to my relatives from Treaty 7, Treaty 6, Mount Royal, Jade, Frigene, Carol, everybody that is here. We have been talking for several months. I sent a message. I was telling the panel here that I was up early this morning and I sent a whole bunch of emails out, and we've been working on this for several months. We would meet and chat, and back then during COVID, COVID has been a blessing in disguise for me because I was able to spend 14 months back with as my mom's primary caregiver, and being on Manitoulin Island, which grounds a lot of everything of what I am, what I do, and all of that. And so I want to open here with a quote right away. When I first started being an academic or a scholar, which even back when somebody said, "Oh, you're a scholar," I just, you know, it's so ingrained, especially being a child of the 60s, which children were scooped up all around me. My dad was a news junkie, and he would have the newspaper, the Toronto Star, open. And I always wondered why when you would open up the Toronto Star, there would be an Indian baby child, and they'd be looking for a home. And I just couldn't understand why were all of these. And of course, now we know what a 60s scoop is. So I was a child during that time. And we get society, this quote comes to mind is, I was listening to Murray Sinclair on TV Ontario last year. He was doing a reflection on reconciliation. So Google it, look it up, it's really interesting. But what struck me is, because Claire opened up with talking about curriculum. Both Tanya and I are educators. I am doing my doctorate with the Faculty of Education at University of Alberta, and I'm an assistant professor at Mount Royal University, a place that I never imagined. I mean, I always wanted to work in education, but I had never imagined that I would become a professor, and here I am. So when I was thinking of what Murray Sinclair said, is he was talking about the school system and the curriculum, and basically said that it's designed to create white supremacists. And I tell my students that all the time. But at the same time, I talk about, we must understand the past. I could cite so many, but if we understand the past, and because I'm going to read a piece later on that talks about my anger. And I find that when people are arriving at their identity, there's a lot of anger. And that was me as a teenager, being very angry when I realized the truths of the history and what colonization. Of course, the term colonization wasn't a term back then. It was just damn white people. And so when I did my first year, I moved out to Alberta in the early 80s, and they started at the University of Lethbridge, and Pam Colorado, Leroy Littlebear, and Thomas King were my first year profs. When I say I was mentored by iconic, I'm very fortunate in my first year to have these icons as my professors, but really grateful that before I left Toronto, had people, and I don't know if she's in the audience right now, but people like Carol Roundtree and Thompson Highway and Roger Bonso and Millie Redmond, all of them of the 60s and 70s, that kind of made me decide to come out here to the Prairie Provinces. So one of the first, because both Tanya and I are talking about bringing our dance and how it takes me forward. It is my dance. And even though I don't teach in an arts program, like I'm not in a fine arts program, I'm not in theater arts. I actually have taught English literature. I teach in liberal arts. I teach in humanities currently right now, and Indigenous studies. So, but I wanted to read out a quote, and it's by one of my famous theorists, philosophers, thinkers, and that's Joseph Campbell. He was a mythologist, and his wife was with the Martha Graham Theater Company, and this is in the 40s, the 50s, long time ago. And I don't know, maybe I'll put it in the chat room after, but he said, and you know, when you step into the academy, because most of them are educators and have been westernized, and I always use this story of we try to fit in a box. We try to fit in the box for education, you know, and what's stuffed in and then what comes out. And so Joseph Campbell, because his wife was a dancer and he spent so much time just engaged with her. I love this quote. He says, In general, it can be expected that the inspiration of the dancer will derive from nonverbal sources. I knew that intuitively, but once I stepped forward into the academy, a part of me struggled to leave it behind because I was trying to be a teacher. And the next sentence goes, she is no virtuoso of the cerebrum. Of all people, she is the least constrained to conception through the head. But if by chance some word, some phrase, or sentence from a book should move her imagination, then she must retire to her own quietness and brood the mysterious gift. The seed requires time to stir to life the contents of her own silence. She is no body forth of materialization, not a charade. And I use that quote to introduce, I'm going to, we might go back and forth, I'm not sure, we didn't work out the details, but I want to share this one story, and then maybe I'll share it back to Claire or Tanya. I want to share a story of how kind of Tanya and I met. And actually this year is, I thought of it as I was reflecting, Tanya, 25 years ago. 25 years ago, I had been teaching dance, in community centers, at the Indian Center when I was a teenager, Center for Indigenous Theater and Native Earth in Toronto. And then one year in '96, the Banff Center called upon me and brought me in and wanted me to teach dance. And when I teach dance on the res, because I mostly had just done community, a small gathering, and we get together in a community on the reserve on Manitoulin and Wemikong, my reserve where I'm from. But this particular time I was going to the Banff School of Arts in the Rocky Mountains, and I was nervous as heck, just nervous as heck, because in those days, it wasn't common that you teach Indigenous dance, powwow dance. So there I was, and there was, I don't know, a dozen and a half, some people who are grounded culturally, such as Tanya, some people who are recapturing their identity, who are grasping and taking into whatever they can. So when I found out who my participants were, not all, but a good portion had graduated from Toronto Dance Theatre, had gone to ballet schools in Canada, something that I have never done. But so I thought, wow, people who are professionally trained, it should be really a piece of cake to get them to learn how to powwow dance. So we get to the studio. I love studios, all the mirrors and the ballet bars and everything. We sit on the floor. We go to the floor right away in our stretchies and old t-shirts, and everything is just cozy. And we're sitting there, and not far was the choreographer, the artistic director, who's Alejandro Rancieros. And so he's prepping, getting ready, because I had this block of time. It was my block of time to do traditional dance. So I'm sitting there and I'm telling this story, and I'm telling that story, and this story I'm telling about how this dance was. And I just was loving the moment, and seemingly the dancers were enthralled with hearing these dance stories. And then we paused for a break. And then Alejandro comes up to me and he says, Karen, those stories are really great. He goes, but we have some choreography to do, and we've got a show we've got to go into rehearsal by the end of the week, and the show's got to be in X amount of days. He goes, they need to be able to do Indigenous dance. So I go, oh, okay. So then I thought I was doing Indigenous dance by telling the stories. So then I had brought a stack of CDs with me. This is before Spotify days. So I go up to the sound box and I throw in my CD there, and I put it on. So I stand in front. I said, okay, everybody stand up or sit or whatever. And I put my hands on my hips and I dance, and my song's going, and I'm dancing away, feeling pretty good. I'm one of my favorite drums, and I kind of looked at the dancers, and they're all like this, and they're all looking at my feet. They weren't looking at me, they were watching my feet, and I'm like, So then I go, okay, and I put it on. I said, your turn. So they got up, and some got it, but a bulk of them could not get when a downbeat came, when a honor beat came, when the stop came, and the tempo and everything. There I didn't understand. It was all new to me. I had never professionally trained dancers before. So we were attempting and I stopped the music. I go, wait a minute. I go, you really need to listen. You really need to listen. Put the music on again and get them going again. Still, it wasn't happening. So then I'm like, okay, and then it was over and it was a new day. And I thought, so I went down, have you ever been to Sleeping Buffalo Mountain or Banff Center? If you go hiking down to the corner there by the Bull River, there's some falls. And I tell this story because of what, and this is a brand new book. It's just 2017. I just discovered it this summer. He says, she must retire to her own quietness and brood the mysterious gift. And so this is 25 years ago. So I went to the rocks and I went with my offerings and I went with my protocols. And I sat there beating myself up saying, I'm a terrible teacher. I'm a really bad teacher. These are professional dancers. And I showed them and they're not getting it. They're not executing the call and response to a powwow drum. And so I was sitting there beating myself up thinking what a bad teacher I am because I don't know how to convey to them what we're doing. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching the water hit the rocks, and the water was coming at the Bow Falls, and the water hits. And as you know, the water, when it hits the rocks, it doesn't hit and stay there. When the water hits, it bounces off the water and it bounces off. The water hits, the waterfalls. So I'm sitting watching it, and then I was what Joseph Campbell calls that mysterious gift. And then all of a sudden, a memory came back to me. And it was a memory of when I was dancing around water in Wisconsin. I had been at a powwow, and in the Midwest, when it really rains hard, what they do at a powwow is, which obviously they're not dancers because they would never do this, but they fill the powwow arena, the dance floor, the soft, soaking wet dance floor with sawdust. And what happens is, yes, the sawdust soaks up the water, but then it becomes a layer of almost like sponge. And when you're dancing, powwow dancing, Indigenous dance, you dance to the earth and you feel that earth. And that's the energy that comes in that earth, comes into you, and the song comes and then you dance. So we had a straight song. It was a contest. And so there's usually two songs in contest. So the first song is straight and the second one is a side step, which is the healing dance. And so, and I'm a Jibigashigegan dancer, a jingle dress dancer. So the song is a straight song and I dance. I mean, it was a bit of a struggle. My feet was getting stuck in the mire of the sawdust and I was trying to work it and I was doing whatever. And then so that was done. And I was very lucky. Whitefish Bay drum was there, which comes from Treaty 3, Lake of the Woods, which is home to the Jibigashigegan, the jingle dress. So I struggled with that first song because we were into sawdust. So when it came for the second song, I decided I'm going to come right by the drum, Whitefish Bay. I'm going to come over here so that when they sing, I'll really hear them and I'll feel them. So I'm coming and I'm dancing and I'm clumping along in the first push-up. So there's 4 push-ups in a song and I'm clumping along in the first push-up. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is hard to do because it's supposed to be graceful and it's going along the floor like this. So I'm coming, and then as I got very close to my back to Whitefish Bay drum, I felt it. My dissertation work talks about the soul. I talk about the soul nerve. And it's this story that I think of because that song came in and it had nothing to do with hearing it here. It came in my backbone. It touched my soul. And as I came by the drum, as I said, it was clumping along. And then I got within the drum, the area of the Whitefish Bay drum, my body lifted up. My body lifted up and it gracefully floated atop the sawdust for the whole song. And I could feel that song lift me above and take me. And then the song ended and my feet dropped down. And I'm just like, I can't believe that. And all the women are lining up. So I quickly line up and I'm like, still sitting there in awe. I mean, I've been dancing almost my whole entire life, but still the way that that song lifted my soul up across the sawdust, had my number checked, the tears started coming, and then I ran up to camp and I was crying and my kids checked on me, worried about me. Are you all right, Mom? Are you all right? I go, I'm all right. I said, it's just that feeling is indescribable. And so that memory, as I was sitting on the rocks at the Bow River Falls in Sleeping Buffalo Mountain, where I was teaching, that story. So the next day when I went back, I talked to all of the dancers that were there, and I stopped saying, listen to the song. We listen with our soul. And I have a second story that I'm going to pause on, but it took that journey, and I've been sitting with that story for the past 25 years. And even when I was at the University of Alberta is logged in as top 5, top 10 in Canada. And so I felt very, when I was teaching there prior to Mount Royal, I was honored to be teaching there. So I was trying to fit in a box. And then an event happened that changed, where I brought my dance to the classroom. That's another story that I may or may not, but I'm going to read something later, but I'm going to leave it to Tanya now.
Well, I just want to say, Kriana, Karen, for sharing story with us. And, you know, I mean, this is partly why I asked you to be in relation and to visit, and why I've so enjoyed our time together, reconnecting after such a period of time. I feel like I do need to introduce myself, to say, you know, Chamai, Hui Shuk, I'm a Shukpiak or a Lutek. I'm from the native villages of Fognak and Port Lions in southwestern Alaska. I'm an island girl like Karen. I'm also from an island. So I think sometimes that is something special between us. But also we met in Banff many years ago, and she was one of several teachers that I had between the Center for Indigenous Theatre and the Banff Center. And then in Edmonton, I lived in, excuse me if I mispronounce it, Amiskwaciwaskahigan, Edmonton for 9 years. And now I live in Nibising and Anishinaabe territory, not far from Manitoulin Island, where Karen is. Those are her homelands. And so we have these different kinds of relationships to these different places. And while I have been very, you know, lucky to have studied with different people like Alejandro Ronceria or Georgina Martinez or other folks, Michael Grey Eyes, Boylad, different people who, you know, gave me the belief in myself that I could dance, that was a possibility as a young person. It was really Karen who really helped me to think about what dance does in the world. And her rigor, her discipline, her compassion, and her deep belief in what dance does, you know, stayed with me. And as I continued to study dances from home, I'm not a traditional dancer because we didn't have a traditional dance group in my village growing up due to, you know, colonization, which I won't go into too much, but due to history. I always had a deep respect for it. And even today I was dancing a little bit, and I was thinking about the dancers who are from the Lucian chain and how much their dance marked me, but also Yupik dancers and Inupiaq dancers in Alaska, and also Karen and her stories about jingle dance have always stayed with me. And they've really connected with sort of the belief that I have in dance as well, for it to do something in the world, for it to help, for it to be a form of a way to uplift us, as she describes, a way to heal us, a way to help us if we're grieving or experiencing sorrow, but also a way for us to experience joy. And, you know, Karen was a strict teacher in the best sense, but also incredibly generous. And I reached back out to her. She was on Manitoulin, and I knew that because we've been in touch over the years just through social media. But also, so she wasn't far from where I live. I've lived here for over a decade in the Nibisi-Anishinaabe territory. But I've been thinking a lot about jingle dance because of the pandemic, and because of, which Karen knows much more than I do, the origin story of the jingle dress, and how, in my limited understanding, it is connected to the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, which really devastated our communities in Alaska. And so I was thinking a lot about those connections. And I was also thinking a lot during this time about wellness and well-being, and how we care for ourselves, how we have a practice that's sustainable, how we have writing, like whether that's dancing or writing or having a responsibility to family or community, or ceremonial responsibilities. I was thinking about how we were so sped up, you know, before the pandemic, and how things kind of really slowed down. And it really made me reflect on this time that we're in. And I really thought about Karen, and I thought about what she shared with me when I was very young. So Karen, I think actually I came a little bit later to Banff. So I wasn't at that first class. By the time I came, that's okay. By the time I came, you had it down pat, and nobody was telling you to not talk or tell stories. That was a part of it. And that's something you explained to us actually at the outset. You said, this is a part of it. This telling of the story is a part of the work. And that stayed with me and has really affected my thinking about my own practice as someone who works in relation to orality and also dance with dancers. I just want to share a little bit about that. And there's going to be some sound in the background. Please, it's just life happening in the background. So if you notice that, just as an FYI, but maybe I'll hand it back to you to share a reading if you're ready for that.
Okay. Just to give context to everybody here, Coach House Press and a group of other amazing people out of Toronto collected stories. Daniel David Moses, Thompson Highway, Elaine Bomberry. We're a whole bunch of us people from back in the day submitted these pieces. And I tell this story because sometimes individuals meet me and they say to me, Karen, you're so lucky you know your culture. But I don't, because I grew up in the city. I don't say this anymore, but I used to say, oh, I'm a Torontonian. My parents, because of residential school, because of the horrendous experience my parents had, and you're all familiar now about the English, they just, no matter what, when they decided to have a family, they moved to Toronto. So I wrote this story to acknowledge my mom and dad. And I guess the part of what brought recognizing my dance, because I grew up in a time where dance, and I'm really grateful that Rebecca Sockbeeson here is in the audience, and she always brings, sometimes she'll sing the AIM song at our meetings, and I'm, you know, I teach now, and I'll say to First Nations people, you know, AIM, and they'll be like, huh, what's that? And I'm just like, how can you be Indian and not know what AIM is? But anyway, so my dance was my saving grace. But before I read that, I'm going to read from here, and the book I did on powwow, and hearing the, so I'm going to, it's just a small paragraph, and then I'm going to go into the other piece. Hearing the drums and the power of the songs at the powwow and being with so many other First Nations people was incredibly powerful and exciting. It was as if once I put on our Indian dance clothes, a power took over us on the dance floor. The closer I moved to the dancing spirit, the lighter my feet would become. When I was little, I would get lost among the dancers, hiding from the tourists who were watching. But as I began to feel the dance spirit, I would forget about the tourists. Those joyful moments were breathtaking. They were also an escape from the harsh realities of being Indigenous in the city where we lived. So over our meetings of the past with Claire and all of this, we decided, I'm just going to read a little portion from, you want to show the cover, Claire? Of from this, I have a chapter here, Stories That Carry This Place. So I'm the firstborn of my parents. Our world at the time stretched from Spadina to Parliament, north to St. Clair, and south to the waterfront. Dad's favorite Sunday morning walks were over to Queen's Park, circling the large trees while pushing the carriage proudly, living his dream. The walk generally included a stop for Mom and Dad at Fran's restaurant on College Street for an ice cream cone. As our family grew, stopping at Fran's for an ice cream became a rare special treat. It wasn't until a recent recounting of the story by my mom that the vision of me crawling up onto the blue vinyl stools came to mind, reaching for my ice cream cone on those hot summer days. My parents, but more so my mother, lived by the structured, strict, and righteous order that reflected a colonialist rule instilled by her Indian residential school experience. The 1950s and 60s were not a safe time for Indians in the big city. Living in the slums, dealing with evictions, and being taken advantage by landlords were unfortunate truths. By the time we were school age, my parents attained their first home from a little old Italian man who owned shops and other homes. Only after the second bombing of his second building did my parents realize that the ongoing mafia war included our mortgage holder. Our life had to change drastically, and we did. That's a whole story in itself. By the time we were young teens, Mom knew we had to do other activities. Though we lived in the city, all of our free time was spent going back home to the reserve. It's what we knew, it's what we did, to be with family on Manitoulin Island. As much as we went to white schools and lived in white neighborhoods, we did not know that life. Only friends and relatives from our reserve or other reserves came to our house. Rarely was English spoken when we had visitors. Mom did attempt to socialize us to the city. She had us go to the United Church for Girl Guides, but we didn't fit in. Then she sent us up the street on St. Clair Avenue to the Catholic Church. Again, we didn't fit in. Just as the Jesuit order was a strong part of our Wikwemikong home, it was a strong part of our Toronto life. Once, one of the brothers dropped in for a visit. My mother shared her woes of not finding a place for us teenagers to fit in. He suggested the Indian Center and said, call Millie Redmond. He told Mom, she's a kind, helpful lady, and she will have something for your kids. This set Mom on a mission to meet Millie Redmond and see what she had in mind for my sister and I. Millie responded that she didn't have any teen programs, but would think of something. Not long after that, Millie suggested a powwow club with outfits and dancing and outfit making. I was 14 and the only powwow I had seen was on my home reserve every civic holiday weekend. I did not know anything about powwow dance or how to create powwow clothes. As much as I loved to dance, I was shy and no clue what I would do at a powwow club. Shortly afterwards, the Jesuit brothers dropped by the house again and was glad to hear about the Indian Center and the powwow club. He pulled my mom aside and warned her about those people who attend the club. Those who sit and sing around the drum, he said. Be careful. Those people can get militant and very political. Our home became a regular stopping place for newcomers and settled Torontonian Indians. It was nice when community members dropped by for tea. Overall, it was a busy time in Toronto. Dad was a news junkie, both with evening news and TV and the Toronto Star. One of the regular headline names and visitor to our home was Jeanette Corbière-Laval. She became a big dinner time topic as her Supreme Court case and the atrocity of the impacted her with her loss of Indian rights. In the bigger picture, there were political stirrings across Canada and the United States. In 1969, the 19-month takeover of Alcatraz Island by the American Indian Movement, AIM, created an uproar in both countries. Not far down the road, across the border, the activism of the civil rights was happening. We in Canada were not far behind. Like my father, I followed in becoming a news junkie. It was 1972, and the Black Panther movement and Angela Davis were regular topics of discussion in our home. Each Tuesday, I hurried home after school for dinner, did the dishes, and headed out to 210 Beverly Street to the Indian Center. The weekly powwow club became a spiritually driven, nurturing time for me. I learned the AIM song, Rebecca, and listened to the stories of those who came to the US or from out west. At the same time, I read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. That was my turn of the switch moment. Dee Brown's book taught me about the hidden stories of colonialism and its impact on Native Americans. I was angry. All the history classes I took in school had never taught me about the slaughter, the death, and the lies that the governments inflicted on Indian people. I was raging furious. The phone rang one evening. Rosemary, aren't you proud of your children? Rosemary, aren't you proud? My mother responded. What are you talking about? The caller on the other end of the line said, didn't you see the news? Right now, they're on the news. My mother turned on the television to see me front and center at the Queen's Park legislative buildings. Beaded headband adorned my glowing cinnamon face, and a strategically placed Indian and proud button adorned my jacket. We were hundreds of Indian rights activists marching, protesting, singing the AIM song, loud and proud. Mom hung up the phone, stormed up the stairs, woke me up and yelled, were you at school today? I saw you on the television. I was silent. She was raging. Fact is, I was a little too young to hang out with the AIM people. I continued with the weekly powwow dance program. It was my saving grace, being with Indians, learning songs and dancing. Although I did not know it at the time, powwow dance became a healing salve for me. I'm just going to maybe do another paragraph. It felt safer and my parents seemed okay with it. Structure, routine, and righteous order returned to our daily lives. A short while later, the Jesuit brothers stopped by again to visit my mother. She had long calmed down after the political protests. After the AIM political protest, the brothers suggested, since powwow's going so good, you should go to a good powwow, a big powwow, like the one at Mount McKay in Thunder Bay this summer. My dad always had a curious nature about him and loved traveling on the back roads of new terrain. When an adventure was suggested to visit Nimkiwachu, locally known as Thunder Mountain, Mount McKay, Thunder Bay, both my parents' excitement grew. That was the summer that Nimkiwachu touched my dance spirit. Pause there. by the way, I had so much fun writing that. Some sentences are a story in itself, and maybe this is a book down the road. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Karen, when I read this, I thought I was just blown away because, you know, when I went to university in the early 90s, or I guess the mid 90s, I learned about these histories for the first time because, you know, they don't teach that to you in school, K to 12, right? You don't learn that history really. I mean, now they're trying to change things, of course, in the curriculum, speaking of curriculum. But it was when I went to university and I went through this period of you know, a couple of things. One, I got a chance to read all of these like beautiful narratives of lived experience by Indigenous women and women of color. And that was really transformative for me and really stuck with me in terms of how our lived experience, we live through these histories and how they come to, you know, mark our lives and shape us. And so hearing you here when I first read it and then hearing you read it, one, you're an amazing storyteller, which I already knew, but also it just kind of brings it really real, like those moments that I've read about AIM and its formations and this experience in places like Toronto or Minneapolis or San Francisco back in the day. Like it really brings it present and alive. And so I thank you for sharing those stories. It's also hard to go after that because you're such a great storyteller. And it's like full of action. And there, like you said, it's like there's so much inside of each of these sentences, like other stories that are folded in. And so I feel like I'm a little nervous to share.
You're a rock. Just rock on there, Tanya. Go for it.
But
just sit back and enjoy.
One thing I wanted to say though is that I forgot to say that is just I've been thinking a lot about how, and this speaks to it, is that this has been a lifelong practice for you. This has been a lifelong practice that has been sustained over your lifetime, that you started as a young person, but that I know from our visits and from the time that you trained me, which was actually over 3 different summers, very formative in my life when I was in my early 20s, that it's daily, you know, it's running, it's your yoga practice, it's bringing the mind, it's physically training. It's also, I think, personally, mentally and spiritually training as well, emotionally training for the work that you're doing. And I just have so much respect for that. And I just want to lift that up and lift you up because, yeah, you've had such a mark on so many people. And we've talked a little bit about this, and it might be because I haven't seen where these are written, but I wonder sometimes where these histories of Indigenous performance are written. You know, where are they held? They're held with us. They're held through our lived experience. Exactly. And so it's such an honor to be able to visit with you over this period of time and to hear these stories, and also for there to be like a record, you know, continuing a record of this important work. So I'm going to share a little bit. And I've been writing, so like Karen, I'm a PhD candidate. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's in Cultural Studies with some really great people that I'm working with right now. But I did do my master's in First Nations education, it was called at the time, at University of Alberta as well. So we have that shared experience of that program and some of those amazing people who've been a part of that program and have been really influential in terms of perhaps our respective thinking separately and together over time. So I'm going to share a bit, and I'm reading, so we'll see how it goes. Indigenous thinkers, writers, activists, and grassroots people have continuously advocated for a return to and recovery of Indigenous ways as restorative actions for our peoples. So this advocacy for a return to our practices connected to our thought and affective worlds is rooted in the belief that these practices will support a continuous repair of our families, our peoples, and our communities. The old people and ancient structures inform this turn towards our own forms of time and space found within our cosmologies and experienced by our peoples, including through the body and senses. These anti-colonial Indigenous movements across North America from the 1950s on provide an historical, political, and cultural context for the work I'm undertaking as an artist broadly. My work is rooted in Indigenous knowledge, shared with me over time, and aligns with generations of Indigenous scholarship and action, politically and otherwise. So I'm going to speak a little bit about Alutiiq or Shukpiaq peoples and our history, because we've been undertaking a process of recovery and restoration since the early 80s through many activities. And I'm going to name some of those activities. So we have set in motion, or community members, Alutiiq or Shukpiaq community members have set in motion this kind of work in relation to ancestral knowledges, including the continuance of traditional land-based and embodied art forms such as mask making, processing of gut, tanning of fish skin, gathering and curing grasses and roots, steaming bentwood, fur sewing, beading, song composition, weaving, and dance. And we also visit ancestral or cultural belongings in museums to learn from their construction, spending time with the information encoded within the forms left to us by our ancestors. And these activities taken together become a kind of decipherment and recovery of knowledges left to us by our ancestors. And I'm only one person in the midst of this movement, attempting to learn in our collective efforts towards repair. But this recovery of Alutiiq knowledges, even as I live in diaspora from my homelands, has been a significant concern of mine for decades. And I alluded earlier to the fact that Karen and sort of the thinking and the sort of information about jingle dance has been really formative for me. My daughters are jingle dancers, old style jingle dancers. And where I live in Nabisi and Anishinaabe territory, jingle dance is strong, I feel here. And also my time in Alberta, I said earlier, that was very formative for me, not only in that training that I did at the BAM Center, but also in the time that I spent making friendships, lifelong friendships and relatives in these sort of invisible networks in Alberta. So I want to mention that my thinking about where I'm from is informed by the teachings that I've learned from other places. And I guess that's the kind of complexity of being an Indigenous person today, is that sometimes we don't always live just in relation to our homelands, but we live in other places and we learn from other people. So I'm just going to briefly speak about this method of felt structures. It's embodied, ephemeral, invisible, and felt, because I'm trying to put a little bit of language to this collective undertaking. Our Alutiiq knowledges were in relation to our homelands, waters, and atmospheres, our minds, and bodied practices such as subsistence, ceremony, and language. But further, these felt structures are atmospheres that held us, our people, our ancestors, our belongings, and homes in relation to an alive universe, allowed us to see the universe differently, a cosmos that was connected to our bodies, our very beings, and a constellation of relations. And I was actually telling someone the other day, I was like, you are a specific person that has specific set of relations. And the reason that I say that is that, yes, there are these beautiful constellations of relations that exist and continue to exist in the world, even if we have a sort of tenuous relationship with some of the old beliefs where I'm from. But so that exists regardless, but we each of us have a specific set of relations. And so I sort of spoke to that earlier, when I talked about how I've lived in these different places and been in relation to these different people who've affected me over time. So our villages are most often located on the coast in this zone, this kind of space between, we're in relation to a geography continuously shaped by marine, terrestrial, and atmospheric forces. And our villages are only reachable by plane or boat. And we're continuously in relation to weather, storms that are carried by the wind to our shores. And we look upwards to the clouds and to the changing nature of the ocean's tidal levels regularly, as the weather structures or determines our activities on any given day. And it has for multiple millennia, and it's a force that we cannot ignore. And listening to and forecasting the weather has actually been a really valued activity for Alutiiq peoples over time. So in our language, the word for cloud is kilak, which also means sky. And the sky is where clouds are composed and where electricity is constituted into lightning and where water vapor is arranged alongside particles forming droplets. It's where storms are assembled through air currents, gathering momentum until they're released upon us. And storms are both life-giving and wreak havoc. And the word for weather in our Alutiiq language is tla, and tla means outside, outdoors, universe, world, awareness, consciousness, wits, sense. But these multiple meanings for tla gesture towards an Alutiiq cosmology unseen but present in the changing nature of the weather and persistently shifting cloud cover and the distillation, force, and volume of precipitation and the unsteady windsweptness of Kodiak Island. How are you guys doing? Does this feel like okay? I like to check in. Is it all right if I keep going? Okay. Maybe check the chat, Claire, and see how people are feeling. Okay. So weather is often defined in the English language as the state of the atmosphere. And the atmosphere surrounds the Earth in a series of 5 concentric circles. And the densest atmospheric layer, the troposphere, is closest to the Earth as gravity pulls the particles of the atmosphere towards land and water formations, blanketing us with this thickest layer, allowing the sustenance of life. And this is where weather is present. And then the next atmospheric layers express less materiality in a process of dissipation. And as we move to the furthest atmospheric layers, the air has changed, becoming less substantial, nearly weightless, as gravity is disappearing, transparent, yet still present in the zone between us and outer space or the universe. So air is in perpetually moving currents and different formations that, while pattern, cannot be fixed. And the atmosphere is constituted by air that is invisible yet surrounds or envelops us, moves us in the rise and fall of our chests and bellies, and the quiet expanse of our rib cages with each inhale, the suspension and empty pauses between exhales, the continuousness of breath, a cycle embodied moment by moment, is shared amongst us. Yet Enoch-Nukuna, this breath, is also firmly in our bodies in this moment right now. And each of us shares in this breath that is everywhere at all times, yet unseen. And this breath is connected to clouds and plant life and shared amongst us in each sip and gulp. So I come to this thinking and writing by looking at times to the sky and considering the ways that clouds lit by the sun at dusk and dawn make visible the air that we sense is ever changing, kind of elusive materiality that's of our bodies and the world simultaneously. And we might say that Enoch-Nukuna connects us to the universe through the air that is of our bodies and the concentric sky worlds above. So this more than human structure that envelops us is also bodily. And we are connected to creation, to life, to one another, and to the cosmos through Enoch-Nukuna. And I'm proposing these kind of potential meanings of these words in my language. And perhaps this is the work of artists to propose new meanings that are building upon the intellectual traditions of our elders, our speakers of our languages, and other thinkers who have discerned meaning over time. And specifically, I'm thinking about Nicola Oakley and Sophie Kotelnikov, who are both passed away this year, who are Alutiiq speakers, and also the late Angayukak, Oscar Kwagli, who's Yupik, Alicia Drebeck, April Lactonen counselor, and others. But I feel like I'm extending their analysis and composing understanding that builds upon their translation and interpretation. I'm just going to say that Kristen Simmons speaks about this idea of settler atmospherics and their role in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violences and Black Lives Matter at Standing Rock, and I would suggest elsewhere. Partly as, quote, the conditions we breathe in are collective and unequally distributed with particular qualities and intensities that are felt differently through and across time. And I really think that ongoing anti-Black violence, climate crises, and our political mobilizations in response only make felt structures feel more urgent. Their constant motion, impermanence, shifting, fading, density in moments, and dissipation in others like cloud cover. We have to kind of use our senses to in these processes of perceiving them and discerning them and responding to them. But I really feel that as part of my practice, that felt structures can be a kind of set of ethics that guide my work in the present moment as a kind of kindness towards my ancestors and to the world at large. Embodied knowledges, which is what Karen and I are speaking about, embodied knowledges that hold a future potential. And I'm proposing that they might be simultaneously past, present, and future becoming. So that's sort of where I'm at right now in my thinking about them. And I wanted to share a little bit because we're speaking about Indigenous performance methodologies partly, which is this sort of combination of all of these different registers and scales simultaneously, of mentorship, of relationship, of orality, of lifelong practices, of sustaining that even when it's so difficult. And in fact, that I look to people like Karen and others who have sustained language or dance practices or song practices in very difficult circumstances at times, and who have been recovering and retrieving this knowledge and enacting it and making it felt in the world and important, you know, at this moment and at this time. I may have spoken way too long, so I'm going to end there, and then maybe Claire, we can do a little bit of visiting.
Oh, thank you so much, Tanya and Karen. I feel like this is again a sort of model of how our conversations usually go, which could span in, you know, cosmic.
I was going to interject, and I appreciate Tanya. You know, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You'll have to Google what 8th fire and 7th fire means. But the 7th fire is when my generation, they bring back the teachings back, and Tanya is the next generation, and listening to her and watching her over the past 20 odd years, it's how they pick up that torch and they carry on and mold and come to this amazing, I just know, and I shouldn't say just, Tanya and I were dancers, but Tanya also is an installation artist and does a lot of amazing work and draws and brings that together. So I'm so impressed, but I wanted to pick up and partly what Tanya was speaking about and what Beverly Kishik Sunya has brought up is the land part. And going back to, because oftentimes, because I see some educators here in the seats here, and I have some artists here, and sometimes, you know, our students think, well, I'm in the city, or I don't know my identity, or I don't know who to ask. And then I think, you know, it's very intentional when that part I read out where I said, my dad would walk around the Queen's Park circle. And I imagined, and I was a newborn, but I imagined that he must have been saying these prayers. I was born on University Avenue. And then as a teenager, the next major block over onto 210 Beverly or Spadina, I spent, and if you listen to Alan Corbier, I'm just going to name drop here, but he's from Manitoulin Island and quite the historian. And I understood when I was in Toronto this summer that there's this tour you can take that gives you the Indigenous history of Toronto. And so I think the fact that when Carol Roundtree and all of them did the fundraising at Casa Loma for that new Indian Center on 16th Spadina Road, where I took contemporary ballet classes with late Renee Highway, it was by no coincidence that was, there's a story about that path. That's actually an old path of Indigenous people on Spadina up to Casa Loma. And so I spent that time there, and I can't help but think that in what I just read out with Joseph Campbell said, if by chance some word, some phrase or sentence should move her imagination, she must retire to her own quietness and brood the mysterious gift. And so here in Edmonton, I do that by the North Saskatchewan River. I spend almost morning daily walks out there. I don't do the kilometers like I did when I was a young gal, but I do those stairs. And if you, I see I have a whole bunch of social media friends here, you know, I do those stairs up and down, and it's so that I could dance and keep my well-being. But what I thought I would do is I just, part of the description of what we're going to talk about is about the embodiment. And you know, that story that I'm reading out in bits and part, I asked my mom that story again when I was home last summer with my mom. And so she told me that story, I can't help it. I have to animate it as I do. But I was thinking, I'm gonna just the paragraph here. It was whoops. I have a digital copy here, so I. It was almost 50 years ago at Inimkiwachu where I witnessed the Shibigashigegan Nokomisik, the jingle dress grandmas, dancing in Thunder Bay. Shibigashigegan were made with jingle cones, customarily with rolled tobacco lids. It was more commonly known as the jingle dress, which represents healing, both literally and figuratively. It is understood that this dress came to the Anishinaabe to bring healing. So in part, I'm going to acknowledge when I sit in Treaty 3 and I sit, and there's a few kokums here, I think, from the Treaty 3 area. And when I sit, we were talking about late Ann Wilson this summer when I stopped there and spent quite a bit of time there this past summer. Well, I do it each summer. And they're talking about late Ann Wilson. And Ann Wilson was speaking to a gal about making a dress. And the gal said, I'm not a dancer. I'm not a dancer. And Anne had told her, it's the creation process. Just make that dress. And you can just see a part of my jingle dress here. Make that dress. It's the creation. It's being one with that. And I always say when one wants to learn to dance, you need to go and sit on that land and be with that and feel that come through your soul, come through your feet, come to your backbone. And that's where the healing comes from. It doesn't necessarily mean that one has to don a dress and go to a powwow and dance. It's about creation, your creation of whatever you are as an author, as a beater, as a keep that handy because when I'm teaching, I have a unit I talk about that. But maybe what do you think, Claire? Should we open the floor? Or
Yeah,
Tanya?
perfect timing, Karen. And thank you so much for that wonderful response. Yeah, I feel like we came a very beautiful full circle. And especially just looking at some of the questions that are coming through, I almost have a feeling that we've already touched on some of these things. Just speaking to also what inspires you both, also what words of encouragement you have for folks who are contending with those gaps in knowledge and practice. Intergenerationally, sort of, you spoke to the 60s scoop, Karen, and just thinking about, what are those ways forward that carry the torch, as you also mentioned, carry the fire, as Tanya and many are doing sort of in their work in also different spheres, thinking, of course, of contemporary arts as a context as well for that. There is a big question that actually came through very early on, and maybe it's one that we could sort of leave as an open one for either of you to respond to. Is, Tanya, you had brought up how Karen has really encouraged you to think about what dance can do in the world. And I know it's a big one, but I wondered if either of you would like to sort of speak to that, and Karen maybe specifically because Tanya had raised it as something that you had really encouraged her to think through, if you have any words on that.
She's not unmuting, and I watch Netflix on the weekend, and I'm going to do a Netflix promo here on the movie. I'm into, one of my undergrad degrees is in English literature, and I studied African-American literature, Frederick Douglass, all the way, Richard Wright, all the way up to Beloved with Morrison. And I think I studied it because I likened it to our oppression that we did. And now I'm going to fast forward to, Tanya brought up Black Lives Matter. When that happened with George Floyd, and I was sitting in Lake of the Woods when the protests were going on. There was one in Kenora, but as you will notice, when they did that first protest at that intersection in Minneapolis, the Anishinaabe Kwe, Shibigashigegan Anishinaabe Kwe, the jingle dress dancers, the women went to support and to do the healing dance and do that. And when I was watching that Netflix movie on the weekend, and although during World War II, technically, supposedly slavery was done, but it never was. And it isn't, it remains today. I even say to my mom, because my mom always refers to her residential school experience as school. But the more I researched, once I became a little bit more learned and I understood what actually residential schools were, I told my mom, those were slave encampments, Mom. Those were horrible places. But like my mom is like Thompson Highway and thinks it's like the next best thing since the invention of the wheel, because she learned how to speak English. But what I got out of the movie, and I'm reminded of that June 1st, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, that summer, I have to say, was a big two points, besides that sitting at Bow River watching the falls and remembering that story of 25 years ago, two crucial turning points in my teaching. One is my time being at the University of Alberta, teaching the required Aboriginal Education 211 course, where I actually did a dance in a class, which wasn't planned because that's a whole long story and you'll have to read my dissertation to read about that. But that was a turning point, but also Black Lives Matter in that summer when I realized no matter what I'm teaching, whether I'm teaching a cooking class, a English lit class, a humanities, a liberal arts class, I bring music and I bring dance into all my classes. I'll throw on Marvin Gaye, I'll throw on Northern Cree, I'll put on Indigenous music from this week I did an Indigenous song from Australia because my course text I'm using an Aboriginal man from Australia. So I had that, but one of my first classes, I throw on Marvin Gaye, what's going on or something like that. And I make the students dance. Yes. I see my former chair is online here, and he said, "What? Karen makes them dance?" Yes, I make them dance, and then I see a dropout the next day. But we weren't made to sit like this. We're not created like that. Perhaps you're going to say, Karen, I'm not a dancer. I try to get it, but I'm one of those people that I firmly believe that we all were dancers, and I could go well. I will say this, and as you can tell, I could go on and on, but the reason powwows were not around for thousands of years. Songs and dances were around for thousands of years. We never did anything without prayer songs and dance. We never did anything. And that's why they did the Indian Act and made it against the law. And that's what anyway, I'm gonna pause there.
Thank you for that,
Yeah.
Campbell. Yeah, Tanya, did you have some thoughts?
I just want to echo that. Like I'm just reading a book right now, and of course it's not right within reach, but it's called Potlatch's Pedagogy. And it's also about sort of the recovery of knowledge for this Haida family and community of Old Masset. And it's, in any ways, it's a father-daughter story. And well, she asks him about his life, and he tells about his life and about this deep work to recover as a result of these laws that outlawed our dancing. And the reason partially that our dances and our songs were outlawed is because we experience incredible power in relation to them. They give us so much. And this is why I keep returning to them and being in relation to them, whether that's as someone who dresses my daughters when they're going to go dance, or who sings sometimes in certain contexts, or, who is an observer and then a participant just in intertribal dances at powwows or in those kind of welcoming dances in Alaska. It's because it's powerful. It's powerful for us. And so I don't know, I don't have any other language about it right now, but this is why it was outlawed for so long, and why our people are working so hard to remember and to bring it back. And in some communities, it's very strong, very, very strong. And in some communities, we're still in processes of sort of recovering those things.
Thank you for that, Tanya. Yeah, and I think in that sense, you've both touched on sort of multiple questions in the thread, and there's some wonderful responses here too on the chat of just how what you're sharing is really resonating with folks. And thank you everyone for also feeding back to that also very intergenerational setting as well that you're all working in. I am looking to time and just thinking maybe this is a good moment to thank you both, Karen and Tanya, just for your incredible generosity with all of us here today and your continued work and very generative practices. I'm going to take this moment to also just really encourage everyone here to follow Karen and Tanya's continued projects. I know a number of amazing resources have been shared here on the chat this evening. It's a curriculum in itself, I have a feeling. I also did just want to mention, I know that Karen, you read shortly from your book Powwow, but I did just want to say on a personal note, what an amazing learning tool I have found it to be, just written in a way that doesn't shy away from difficult conversations, that really kind of, I think, approaches, the multiple layers of history that you've even just sort of touched on with us this evening.
I have to say that it's with Orca Publisher, which is a children's book. I didn't know Orca was a children's, and I wrote the book. It took me a while to write it, and the editors were struggling with me because they wanted me to, they said, you need to write it for middle school. I go, well, I'm writing it as if I'm talking to my grandchildren, and that's how I speak with my grandchildren. So I kept it at that level. So I made it and I have to say that I taught the Education 211 course for 6 years. It was grueling, it was tough, it was a required course, but I taught it for 6 years, and primarily status quo Albertan Canadian students. And I have to say that they feel the context of why I wrote this book. And so anyway, thank you for the good comments that you gave. So just to let you know, it's been nominated for a whole bunch of awards in the children's category. And I've been honored and tickled pink about it, but it never wins. Like the book came out a year and a half ago, because it's categorized as a children's book. And as you just said, I'm dealing with sensitive topic areas. The whole first chapter is just about colonization and what the Indian Act did. And so my book is put in with the children's category, as been nominated for awards, but it's with the cutesy books. So I haven't, the book, another cutesy book wins. And so but I'm still full of gratitude that it gets nominated for. But I do want to share, we're really bad at tooting our horns, but I'm going to toot my horn on this one. The Helen Fleck Award, which is based on how well the book was researched and its contribution to Canadian society. And it's a national award. So stay tuned. April 29th right now is the International Writers Festival in Toronto. So my book made 5, the short list of 5, and I'm really, really excited. I'm hoping, because the cutesy factor isn't the primary criteria. So crossing my fingers on that one.
Amazing. Thank you for that context, Karen. And Tanya, if you don't mind, I'll also mention that Tanya's book, Slow Scrape, which came out last year, is also a really wonderful publication to engage with. It's, by a smaller press. Tanya, I'm going to try and remember the name. It's the Center for Expanded Poetics. Is that correct? And so please try find that online. Great. Megan, I don't know if you had any final words of wrap up, but thanks also to you for hosting us and helping us with all the logistics in the background this evening too.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you to Karen and Tanya. Claire said, this is a generous conversation, and I think that that's a very apt word. I was just really inspired by a lot of the words. I was writing things down in the margins, getting a lot of quotes here. I think that there's a lot I'm going to be thinking about, and looking at the conversations and the things in the chat. I think there are a lot of things people will be taking away tonight. Thank you both for your time, for taking the opportunity to spend your Friday night with us. Thank you to Claire for keeping us on time and on a schedule. And just thank you for everyone else for attending. we really appreciate it. Tanya and Karen have generously said that we'll be able to record this conversation. We will be sharing that around later. So keep your eyes out if there's anything you want to go back to, or you can share with colleagues. It's definitely a fantastic resource.
Brianna, I just want to thank Karen for taking this time to be in conversation over these many months, and for
It's been
her
great.
and
Yeah.
you know, it means so much.
Miigwech, Tanya, and Claire for,
Yeah,
thank you, Claire. That was good. Yeah, we had enjoyable conversations over the past several months that brought us to today.
She's been with us for a lot of it, so it's been really great.
A very unfaithful moderator, but this is how it is. I'm happy to be one. Yeah, thank you everyone for your time, and thank you to everyone who attended this evening. I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes while we sort of wait for folks to log off, but yeah, I know that everyone's got some Friday night cooking and Netflix, in your case, Karen, to get to.
I recommend Tanya and Karen and everybody, if you haven't, look at the chat. There's some very nice comments.